Hey everybody, I want to make a video and talk about one of my favorite guitar players and also an interesting life, and that's Don Felder. I hope you'll consider watching. Well, I hope everybody had a great holiday. I guess the holidays now are officially over, right? I always find this kind of depressing time of year for some reason because you get so worked up for the holidays and they're gone. I wanted to talk a little bit about Don Felder. I wasn't all that sure what to say. I was a little nervous about making a video about Don Felder. He's such a great guitar player, and I wasn't that sure what I wanted to say or even what's my place to say. But I've seen a lot of other commentaries on Don Felder, and I guess his situation with the Eagles is kind of the 800-pound gorilla in the room. He was kicked out of the Eagles in 2001, and I guess that's what a lot of people think of now when they think of Don Felder. But I'll just start out by saying he is one of the great guitar players. And he kind of came into the Eagles a little later, so he was not a founding member in a way, and I think that sort of colored his whole career with the Eagles. And maybe at first it didn't matter too much. I think one of the early songs he played on before he was really officially in the band was Already Gone. And man, if you listen to that, Already Gone, and you hear all those great guitar riffs, I think those are Don Felder and Don Henley and Glenn Frey. They knew a good sound when they heard it. And right away, those aren't like flashy type riffs, but you try to play those. Don Felder is one guitar player where you kind of want to feel like I want to play these kind of pretty close to note for note. And I'm not much for note, but I've never been. I always think, develop your own style. But sometimes there are certain things that are so perfect for the song that they sort of become part of the arrangement. And I think Don Felder's guitar playing rises to that level. And man, that Already Gone is it's a great song, but it's got such good guitar riffs all the way through, and they're so tasteful. They're not flashy, but try to play them, they're just excellent riffs, a lot of bends and slides and really creative ways of thinking. And he played with Joe Walsh all those years, and I actually sort of reviewing this, kind of just thinking about what I wanted to say. I was watching some YouTube videos, and there were a few Joe Walsh versus Don Felder. Who do you like more? And I love Joe Walsh. He's great. And I remember listening to Joe Walsh before he was in the Eagles. So I remember in junior high, I was in 7th grade. I still remember this guy that sat next to me, and this would be in 1973 because I just started junior high, which was back in those days. Our junior high was pretty rock and roll, shall we say. It was kind of rock and roll junior high. And I remember this guy sitting next to me talking about Rocky Mountain Way. And just thinking, wow, that's great, Rocky Mountain Way, and so I had Turn to Stone. I had that So What album. I had several albums because I was in the Columbia Record and Tape Club back then. Much to the chagrin of my parents, I'd always join and get that big introductory offer, and then they'd end up paying for all the records that I bought, and. They never said too much about it, but I bought several of those Joe Walsh records, including So What, which is just a terrific album. I love Turn to Stone, and of course, the James Gang was great. I love the James Gang. Walk Away. I did a little version of Meadows, just kind of my take on it. But I love Meadows, Walk Away, of course, Funk 49, and Help Me Through the Night. And I remember liking all those songs And I think when I started listening to the Joe Walsh and the James Gang, it was late, a little later in high school. One of my best friends was his older brothers were really into the James Gang, and but I still remember at that time Joe Walsh. He was, I mean, people knew. I think he was on Hotel California, but it was still very much, Joe Walsh still kind of loomed large as a solo artist. But Don Felder, I think, never had the solo career that Joe Walsh. So one interesting observation I would have about the difference between Joe Walsh and Don Felder is I think Joe Walsh kind of. I love Joe Walsh's guitar playing in the Eagles, and I think he added what they needed in the Eagles, which was a bit more, rock and roll, and the Eagles can rock, and and you listen to like some of their already gone, but I think when Joe Walsh came in there and you had like Life in the Fast Lane, and I think Joe Walsh's solo career, in some ways he's a more viable solo artist, but I'll tell you what, Don Felder to me, his parts are more indispensable to the Eagles on a lot of those classic Eagles songs, like Already Gone. They need someone to play those really meticulous, fastidious guitar lines that are just so freaking perfect. I'll tell you one of the Don Felder one example that in my mind is his great guitar work on New Kid in Town. Oh my goodness. And it's not flashy, but that's a song where it's a lead guitar. There's lead guitar solos in it. But you sort of feel like, man, this is so perfect and so well done. Everything, the intonation, the selection of the notes, the little bends, that I don't want to just like jam on this. I mean, it's like a part of the song, almost, like the melody. And he's got several like that. And I think Don Felder provided some of the most iconic guitar parts in the Eagles. I mean, really. And you can't imagine those songs like New Kid in Town or Already Gone without Don Felder, Don specifically Felder on those songs. He's just fantastic. One thing I think that, he ended up getting fired from the Eagles. I think he and Glenn Frey in particular not getting along was sort of one of the reasons they kind of broke up there in the early 80s. But when they rejoined for that Hell Freezes Over tour, just great, and they played like that to 2001, and then Don Felder was kicked out of the band. I did that video on Levon Helm and Robbie Robertson, and I think in some ways it's kind of similar in that there were financial elements. And, Glenn Frey and Don Henley wrote so many of those good songs. But one thing I will say is I don't think the Eagles ever really recovered from losing Randy Meisner. Because Randy Meisner he wrote Take It to the Limit. Another beautiful, beautiful Randy Meisner song, I think, is Try and Love Again, which is maybe my favorite Eagles song. They've got some really nice songs, but I think when Randy Meisner left, he kind of always had those really beautiful, they're not really country rock, but those really heartfelt ballads like Take It to the Limit and that Try and Love Again. I'm sure some other ones. Those are the two that come to my mind. I don't think they ever really recovered from him leaving. And about Timothy B. Schmidt, he's considered sort of one of the main Eagles now, but he really wasn't on Hotel California. That's all Randy Meisner. And The Long Run, which was the album Timothy Schmidt came on, I don't think was considered one of their more successful albums. And it was the last album they did before they broke up. So in some ways, Timothy Schmidt, as great as he is, I love that. I can't tell you why. Just beautiful, beautiful. So there's no, these are just my thoughts. I'm a fan. I'm not that young, and I've listened to their music a long time. These are just my thoughts. And I do kind of follow some of these people. But, Timothy Schmidt was not even on a lot of the great Eagles songs that you always think of. In Long Run, there are hits on there everybody recognizes, like, Heartache Tonight and Disco Strangler, which I think is a Don Felder song, and Those Shoes. But the classic Eagles catalog is not Timothy Schmidt. He's not on any of that stuff. That's all Randy Meisner. When Don Felder left the Eagles, I think there were financial issues involved. And again, it's probably like a lot of these bands. Simon and Garfunkel's another one. The guy that writes the songs starts making 10 times as much money. And I think one of the things, I think the Eagles had sort of, when they first started out, it was kind of all for one, one for all. And it was more of a band. But I think pretty early, Glenn Frey and Don Henley established themselves as leaders of that band. I knew a guy. I used to play with the guy a lot, actually, and he had lived in Malibu for like 20 years. And believe it or not, he actually lived like right next to the Eagles, and he said he could hear them practicing. And he actually met the Eagles sometimes, and I guess one time Willie Nelson was over there, and he was hanging out with Willie Nelson. So this isn't a name drop, but I'm just telling you what this guy told me. He told me that Glenn Frey and Don Henley were just meticulous. Some people might say jerks, because they were but they were the bosses of that band. But you know what? And he said he could hear them practicing those harmonies. I think that was really what they would practice. He said you would just hear them practicing those harmonies. And this is in the 70s. Everybody always talks about the wrecked hotel rooms and the craziness of the 70s. But I'll tell you one thing. He said you could just hear them practicing those harmonies over and over again. The same thing, like the same few bars over and over. And that's how you get those great, great Eagles harmonies. And I think a lot of that was driven by Don Henley and Glenn Frey. And they also, so the excellence of the Eagles is a band thing. Definitely, you can't take away from anybody that was on those great songs. But I think a lot of the drive came out of Don Henley and Glenn Frey, and also a lot of the perfectionism. Those Eagles songs are so perfect. But I do, one of the things it seems like that happened is that Glenn Frey and Don Henley were taking more and more control of the band. That maybe had something to do with the fact that Bernie Leadon left and Randy Meisner left, and then ultimately they had this big falling out with Don Felder. Another thing that Don Felder brought to that band around that time, I love Bernie Leadon. You listen to the guitar playing in Lion Eyes. It's like perfect. It's kind of twangy. You wouldn't call it country, though. It's not like Buck Owens' country twang, but it's just perfect kind of country rock guitar. And the lead guitar in that is just perfect. And again, you wouldn't want to change a note. And that's why I think it's interesting they brought Joe Walsh in, because Joe Walsh was kind of like, spent the last year rocking, and did all those great jams, Turn to Stone, Walk Away, and just kind of wild, good old rock and roll. But I don't think the Eagles have ever used him to his full ability, really, in a way, if you look at his solo career, although I'm sure he does a lot of those songs in concert. But the Eagles as a band and Joe Walsh as a solo artist are pretty different. I think they're complementary, and I think Joe Walsh is obviously a great member of the Eagles, but in some ways, I've always thought the Joe Walsh solo career has been kind of subsumed by his membership in the Eagles, which I'm sure is a pretty good gig. I mean, you'd have to be pretty dumb to kick the Eagles, And maybe that's what is kind of my final point is Don Felder, I think he chafed because they kind of lost that all for one, one for all. And I'm sure a lot of it was financial and maybe artistic control. I think I remember seeing on that Eagles documentary that was on TV a few years ago that he had a chance to sign a revised contract and stay in the band, and he wouldn't do it. And then Glenn Frey fired him. And all I'm going to say is, Joe Walsh, I think he signed the contract, so to speak. And, and Timothy B. Schmidt, the Eagles are a pretty good band. And the reality is that Glenn Frey and Don Henley are, I think, the two major figures that resulted in the excellence and the perfection of a lot of those songs. I've heard people say almost too perfect, kind of, but not really. Not really. The Eagles are terrific. And, I think I would attribute a lot of that to Glenn Frey and Don Henley. And when you have kind of alpha dogs like that, they can rub people the wrong way and everything, but boy, they sure did get the excellence out of that group in its heyday. Oh my gosh! But I've always felt sorry for Don Felder because I see him kick around, and I actually, in my own little way, my own local obscure way, I kind of relate to Don Felder because it seems like he whenever you see him on YouTube anyway, he's playing by himself. And I've been in some pretty good bands. I've actually been in some duos that I think are sort of a format that I enjoy, that isn't such a big deal to get together. But a lot of times you'll see him playing by himself on YouTube, and you feel kind of sorry for him because he was in one of the greatest bands of all time, and then you see him like doing Hotel California with a looper or something and kind of singing it, and his vocals aren't up there with Don Henley. I think he would admit that. But boy, oh boy, when it's all said and done, you can't take away from Don Felder the greatness of some of those good. Hotel California, that's another thing. And that's another song where you can really hear the contrast between Joe Walsh and Don Felder, because the Don Felder part that comes in, that's another one where you kind of want to play it note for note or close to it. And then Joe Walsh comes in, and it's kind of like rock and roll, and it's so complimentary, and both those things work so well together. Two great guitar players. But I always felt kind of sorry for Don Felder. I'm sure he's doing fine. I'm sure he co-wrote Hotel California, so I doubt you're going to see him out on the street selling pencils anytime soon. But I've always felt kind of sorry for him because I do think he's one of the great guitar players of classic rock. And I think it's kind of that old story. And I guess I will just conclude that if I were Don Felder, I probably would have signed that contract back in 2001 and just learned to let Don Henley and Glenn Frey boss me around, because those two guys have a track record of running a good band. So you might just eat your ego a little bit. I would, but the second thing is, I kind of wish I'd like to hear and see more about Joe Walsh as a solo artist, and because I always liked his solo career, and I think to some extent the greatness of Joe Walsh has been kind of subsumed into his role as an Eagle, and which is great. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, he's done some great. I like Pretty Maids All in a Row. I think that's a Joe Walsh song, but a lot of the great Joe Walsh songs per se are solo. Even Life's Been Good to Me So Far, that's kind of a comedy song. Joe Walsh is kind of funny. But Don Felder's great. I always felt sorry for him. I would have personally signed that contract in 2001 and given Don Henley and Glenn Frey their due. I don't know what he would say. That's one reason I was kind of hesitant to give my opinion, but that's my opinion, because I do think they're due some respect. And the situation that whatever it was in 1975 had changed by 2000. Come on, that band had become, you call it corporate or whatever, but it was a big industry by the Eagles. And that's just sort of the reality of the Eagles, and there's nothing wrong with that in a way. And I think you do have to give kind of Don Henley and Glenn Frey their due. And sometimes in a band you have those leaders, they'll keep it going. Look, the Glenn Frey died in 2016. I'm sure Don Henley is basically the head honcho of that band. And Joe Walsh and Timothy Schmidt, their names you always hear, but I have and they're more indispensable than ever now, particularly without Glenn Frey. I just read Deacon Frey was left the band. Somebody said there was more to it than the just amicable parting of ways. But anyway, Don Henley, I'm sure, calls the shots in that band still, and that can make you mad. It's always hard. On the other hand, sometimes it's like Napoleon. When someone might be bossy, but if they're telling you what to do and it works, maybe just kiss butt and do it. Put your ego away and just realize, hey, this person actually has a good track record. And that's kind of the way I look at Glenn Frey and Don Henley. All the stories about what kind of tyrants they were in the band, inside politics and everything. But you know what? They kept that band at premium, and I never thought the long run was quite as good. But so I think they never really recovered from the loss of Randy Meisner. And you listen to some of those early Eagles albums. I like the Bernie Leadon stuff, like the Sorcerer's Journey, and but some of those early albums, you hear like a lot of banjo and stuff like that. And I think they kind of wanted to get away from that, so they added Don Felder, and that's the classic. That's the classic Eagles. Featured Don Felder, and you can't ever take that away from him. Like I said, I wish he were still in the band, and maybe if you want to be in the band, you kind of got to kiss Mr. Henley's, you know what, and maybe there's really nothing wrong with that, when you're, it's not like when you're 24, when there's a lot of money involved, and the quality of the music, because I think Don Henley, whatever else you say about him, he has always come out with quality music. And it's not about, maybe it's even not even about money. He has always come out with excellent music. I like some of his solos. The Heart of the Matter, man, that's beautiful. I always thought it had kind of a little bit of an 80s production. I would have liked to have heard them do that awesome song maybe in 1975 or 6, because you do hear kind of the 80s production on it, but the song itself and his vocal, just outstanding. I was never too crazy about Glenn Frey's solo career, like Smuggler's Blues and The Heat Is On, but I think that goes back to the early 80s, and I'm old enough to remember the early 80s, and I remember the kind of culture shock as MTV came out, and because a lot of FM rock, people almost forget that was countercultural, and it was not commercial. It was not commercial on purpose. I remember the first time I heard Dave Mason, this would probably be around 78, and he was on a commercial for Budweiser or something, and people were shocked, like, oh, a rock and roll artist is selling beer, and on a commercial, and kind of like, I think Led Zeppelin was being used to sell shoes, and I'm sure now you're going to see a lot more of this with how these artists sell in their catalog. But I remember in the early 80s when like disco and things were more popular, the kind of culture shock and MTV, and I always thought Glenn Frey's career kind of reflected MTV a little bit and some of the production values of the 80s. But you can't take away anything from either of those two guys. I'm sure Don Felder would say that. But that is my personal opinion, is he was so great for the Eagles, and maybe he should have just... they wrote most of those songs. I think they started that band, and I think their leadership was one of the reasons for his success. So you can't really deny. You got to give the credit where it's due. Got to give the devil his due sometimes. But Don Felder's a terrific guitar player, terrific, and he's, like I said, he's one of those guitar players where you really want to learn it. Kind of his parts are so nice on some of those old Eagles songs, and maybe that's attributable to Glenn Frey and Don Henley, because I'm sure they didn't want just like a big jam. They wanted like really nice lead guitar parts, and so but Don Felder came up with them, and they're great. They are great. I mean, you listen to New Kid in Town. That is such nice guitar playing. And it's not flashy, but that New Kid in Town, that's got to be some of the nicest kind of laid-back country rock style guitar playing I've ever heard in my life. New Kid in Town, and that is Don Felder. So, thanks. God bless.